So, like I said, happy Friday. Hope you have a good weekend. I am going to spam you with quite a lot of lecture here, which is really what I was referring to. So, we got to catch up. I need to do storage formats and archive DBs. I'd like to get us to a good place in preparation for quiz 2, which is coming up next Tuesday. Um, I'm going to mention, I'll just talk about this a bit. So, this is also not too hard. You're going to find this relatively easy, a little bit harder than the first one. Okay. Um, the main thing that you want to prepare for, I would say, because the rest of it's not that hard, is just the ability to export PST files, not to import them, but the ability to export them. Okay. So you want to make sure that your share is functioning properly, you got the permissions correct, so that you can actually write to that location, or whatever location you set up, you know. So I would say make sure you can do that before you get to the quiz, because that's one of those things where if you have to troubleshoot it at the time, it can throw you off a lot, right? But I will be asking for a PST submission as part of the deliverable. Okay? Other than that, it's really going to be based on assignment 2. So assignment 2 is due today, but you can be late in submitting it. It's pretty flexible in terms of deadlines. However, you're going to need the material more or less for quiz 2. Okay. Nothing too fancy, but just so you know, like you don't need all the accounts done and everything. You know, it's not like you have to have submitted, but you have to have gotten a good way through the whole assignment, even if you haven't dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. Okay. Just so you know. And then after that, so, um, it's going to take some time. I'm going to work on trying to automate the correction, so that we can reduce the screenshots that have to go into it. In this one, I can't eliminate all the screenshots. Some of them it's just too hard to do. But I'll do what I can, just to reduce the drudgery, you know? Okay. Any questions about either that or anything else in the course in terms of administrivia? If not, I'll do my BOGO lecture. All right, let's do this thing. So I'll start with archive mailboxes. Damn it. Okay, there we go. Hmm. There we go. Okay. So basically, we're going to talk about what archive mailboxes are, what used to be done, um, you know, and why this is a better solution. That's
That's
Microsoft
Microsoft
marketing,
marketing,
but it's
but it's
also
also
true.
true.
They're
They're
just
just
as a
as a
tech.
tech.
I
I
know
know
from
from
personal
personal
experience,
experience
that
that
archive
archive
mailboxes
mailboxes
kind of are
kind of are
handy.
handy.
There are
There are
people who
people who
object to
object to
using them,
using them,
and
and
I'll
I'll
talk
talk
about
about
that a
that a
little
little
bit
bit
too.
too.
Okay,
Okay,
within one
one
of
of
these
these
two
two
lectures.
lectures.
So,
So,
so
so we'll talk about configuring personal archives, setting up quota,
setting up
setting up
retention
retention
policies,
policies,
policy
policy
tags,
tags,
and the
and the
different
different
types that are
types that are
there.
there.
Okay,
Okay,
which are
which
different.
on-prem.
So,
So,
okay,
okay,
so
so
in-place
in-place
archiving.
archiving.
This is
This
a
is a
replacement
replacement
for
for
the
the
old
old
style,
style,
old
old
school,
school,
and I
and I
say
say
painful
painful
PST
PST
files.
files.
So,
So
PST
PST
stands for
stands for
personal
personal
storage
storage
table,
table,
which
which
is
is
just
just
it's
it's
like
like
a
a
it's
it's
kind of
kind of
like a
like a
mini
mini
database
database
for
for
mail
mail
that
that
you
you
want to
want to
archive.
archive.
Okay,
Okay,
in
in
the
the
old
old
days,
days,
and it's
and it's
still
still
kind of true today, but in the old days, everything was stored in a PST file, right? Um, Later on, they kind of they modified things a little bit. They kind of tagged your working um, your working Scratch file as an OST file,
file,
and
and
then
then
you
you
could
could
create
create
your
your
own
own
PST
PST
files
files
to
to
archive
archive
things
things
in.
in.
Right,
Right,
and
and
so
so
people
people
who
who
have
have
been
been
using
using
Outlook
Outlook
for a
for a
long
long
time
time
are
are
very
very
familiar
familiar
with
with
PST
PST
files.
files.
That doesn't mean that they're very wise about their use, but they're aware of them. They know when they've had problems with them. They know when they've lost data, not necessarily because of them, but because of other issues associated around them, like administrative policies and things like that. So what you'll find is that there's like this, that's kind of funny, but there's a PST PTSD, if you can remember that, where people are like hoarding their PST files because they want to keep them close at hand, and they'll make backup copies, they'll take offline, things like that. So you get a little bit of weird hoarding behavior from boomers and maybe even people my age, where they don't really want to let go of these things. I see that in the MIT actually with some of the management. Because they're worried that administrators are going to automatically delete some of their files.
So, like I said, happy Friday.
And they've been burned by that before. So this is a local archive, which means they can control it. They can take it offline, make duplicates, and all that kind of thing. But administrators have little or no control over these files, which, from the user's perspective, can sometimes be a good thing, right? They want to decide. But sometimes the organization has policies, and the administrator can't ensure that those are actually being carried out, So there could be a concern about data loss or data theft, right? Because somebody may be backing up their PSTs at home, and then their own home system gets stolen or whatever, and we're not, we can't ensure that it's being properly secured. Now, another downside with PSTs is they're not available through OWA. So if you're logging on, if you're logging on through Outlook, your PST will be there on your local system. But if you log on through the web interface, it has no direct access to the local system, and so you can't actually access those files, right? You also can't apply policies on them, which that's one of the reasons users like it. But as an administrator, that's a downside, because then you can't apply the retention policies your organization might require, especially if you're like a regulated entity, Okay, so in-place archives, just a way to store your old stuff, right? It's a just-in-case kind of place where you can put things, okay? Store it on the Exchange server instead of on the local machine of the user, okay? So it is available through Outlook, but it's also available through OWA, and it shows up as a second mailbox. Not really a mailbox, but a second... a second mailbox, essentially. So it's outside of your normal folder structure. And if you apply retention policies, what's going to happen is that occasionally some files, when they hit a certain age, they're going to be moved over into the in-place archive. Okay, so it looks like they disappear from the standard inbox or wherever they're being stored in whatever subfolders, but they're just being moved over to this other archive location. Okay. So this is, working with retention policies. Now, there are different retention policies. So you can archive data. You can also delete data. And so it really depends on how it's configured. If you delete data, it's not going into the archive, right? And that's where users get a little antsy about things. Okay, so if you want to enable an in-place archive for a user, in EAC, it's as simple as going to that user, clicking on them to get their summary of their mailbox, and just enable archiving. So right now it says in-place archiving is disabled, but you can just click on this enable here, and then Bob Smith is going to have an in-place archive available to him. Okay. Now, if you're just doing this as a one-off, that's a good way to do it. If you want to do this for a large number of people, you want to enable mailbox in EMS, right? Identify the user, or you could use piping if you have a lot of users, and then pass the dash archive switch, which explicitly says this is an archive mailbox, not your typical one. Because if you don't do that and you already have a mailbox, it's just going to be like this user is already good, right? And then you have to point to the archive database that you want them to use.
you're
what you should do is have a separate archive database, um, completely separate from your regular mailbox. Okay, that's good practice. But you don't have to. You could actually just point to the same mailbox, and it would just put everything in there. But it's good to separate them out, and we'll talk about why in a few minutes here. Now, in terms of archives, you can set quotas on it. So here we have 100 gigs as an archive quota for this particular user. Okay. And then we issue a warning at 90 gigs, which is, I mean, that's a lot of space available. He's still got 10 gigs left. But the idea here is then they'll get a little bit of they'll get a pop-up showing up in Oulook or in Nova, which is just kind of saying, you're 90% full. So, do what you want with that, but we're just warning you, kind of thing, right? Now, another thing is, it's mentioning here, archive is a premier feature. So you do have to pay extra for the licensing for this. Okay, it's going to cost you a little bit more. That's another reason organizations sometimes don't use this. It's really, you have to talk to a representative at Microsoft to get a sense for what it's going to cost per user, whether that's worth it to your organization, or maybe you'll just enable it for a select few, Okay, now policies. This is all about what do you do with data after a certain amount of time? Okay, so if you're regulated, this can become very useful. If you just don't want too much bloat, this can be useful, but you got to be a little careful with it, right? So before you create any kind of retention policies, you need to create something called a policy tag. Okay, so that just kind of indicates when items from the user's mailbox will be moved to archive or removed from the mailbox. So there are some templates that exist. They can be applied within policies, but you can also create your own. And I'll have you do that later on in the course. Okay. Okay, so here's an example. These are some of the defaults, most of them. Let's see. So you can see that there's different types, right? There's default retention policies, there's personal, and there's another one. I can't quite remember what it is off the top of my head. And some of them are delete policies, and some of them are archive policies. Okay, so if it's a deletion, it doesn't mean that you've completely obliterated the data. Usually, it means it is recoverable. Although that can be massaged. Okay, so you can do a hard delete if you want to. I don't usually recommend that just because somebody's going to have a freak out at some point, right? And you can see that there are different retention periods, and these are the ones Microsoft thinks are maybe a reasonable values you could just choose without having to go in any deeper. Okay, so there's three types of tags. Here we go. So default policy tags, retention policy tags, and personal policy tags. So retention was the one I was forgetting. Okay. So the default policy tag applies to the whole mailbox. That means that everything, the whole kitchen sink, that policy is going to take effect on everything you have there. So that's an administrative setting. That's something that the admin does. It's not something that the user does. Okay. Retention policy tags. Hold on a second. Let me see this. Oh yeah, that's right. Okay. So retention policy tags you can't do deletion. That's one thing. But they apply to standard folders within that you select within a user's mailbox. So things like inbox, outbox, drafts, all of those kind of folders that aren't created by users, you can apply retention policy tags and say if it's a certain age, then I think actually you can delete, but you can't archive. If it's a certain age, you delete it. Okay. I don't know why they don't allow the flexibility of doing one or the other, either delete it or just archive it. But that's what they put in place. And then the third option is personal policy tags. So these first two are administrators who implement them. This last one is the user. Okay. And the user can apply it to any folder they want, essentially. So any ones that they've created that are outside of the normal scope, they can apply it to. And they get to decide what it is you're going to do with it, whether it's a deletion or whether it's an archive. Okay. But as an administrator, this isn't something that you're dealing with. This is something they are. So if as an admin you're getting requests to do certain things and you're like, this is kind of outside my scope, you point them in the direction of a personal policy tag, right? On the other hand, if you don't want to trust the user because, let's say, you're a regulated environment and there are policies about retention of data, then you would want to enforce it with one of these two. Okay. So default policy tags directly applied to the root. Entire mailbox applies. Excuse me. Cat. Retention policy tags applied to a set of default folders. So these are the default folders that you can actually apply retention policy tags to. Okay. There's quite a few here. Most of them you're probably not going to use, but I would probably target. I'd be a little careful with inbox, but you could be a little generous with that one. But things like deleted items, you could be much more aggressive with. Outbox, you might want to be careful with. But junk email, let it rip kind of thing. Sent items, that's probably an archive option. So you can kind of make decisions based on individual folders, right? And now there's not an option for archiving; it's purely deletion. So I keep forgetting which one it is. So you can delete and allow for recovery, or you can permanently delete. That's it. Okay. So you don't get to, you don't get to put it into archive. However, you can be a little gentler on users, so that if they're like, "Hey, where'd my stuff go?" You can actually recover it for them. Okay. And then you have to set, a period of time in days where this kind of action takes place, where it actually gets deleted or kind of semi-deleted. Now, the personal policy tags applies to the personal folder. This one actually allows you to do pretty much everything. So delete and allow recovery, permanently delete, move to archive. Okay. Again, the user's going to worry about that. So if you see different policies, you can create some for users that they can apply, right? So at that level, you can control things a little bit. Now, the personal tags, they only work in Outlook 2010 or higher. If you have anybody using anything else, they're probably not able to even interact with your Exchange server. So everybody should have access to personal tags. Okay, and OS supports it automatically, obviously. Now, it is possible to have conflicts. So you can have multiple tags that link to one policy that's assigned to a user mailbox, but there could be competition between them, right? So you have to watch out for that a little bit. You might have one policy that says delete by this point, and another one that says archive at this point. I can't quite remember what the order is in terms of how they get enforced. So you might have to watch out for that. I don't think I have an answer for that one, though. Now, in terms of how this all gets carried out, there's really just a service running in the background all the time called the Manage Folder Assistant. Okay, and it just constantly chugs in the background, looking at individual mailboxes, sifting through it, and determining which objects need to be either retired or deleted. Right. The idea here is that it's taking a little bit of CPU processing and it's just consistently running in the background, with the idea that it should be running on each mailbox once a day. Okay. So if it's kind of running, it's hitting the end of the day and it hasn't done as much, it's going to take up more resources to get the job done. Okay. You can also do a manual force. So force run it on a particular user. That's just start Manage Folder Assistant, and then you just specify the user that you want to start it on, or the database. Okay. So if you're bumping into a real space issue and it's actually kind of urgent, you can kind of take the MFA process and direct its attention where you want it to go to actually clean things up. So let's say somebody's, they're almost exceeding their storage or they have exceeded it. You could run this manually, and it'll free up a little space, and then allow them to manage their own stuff later, right? Same thing with the database. If your C drive, or not your C drive, but whatever, your storage is kind of running out, then it would be handy if some of that could be shifted over to, an archive mailbox. Okay, so if you apply that to a whole database, that will shrink the database, give you enough space, and then you can then do some management on your own. Okay, so you're not hitting a brick wall, essentially. Okay, now in terms of on-prem versus online, there's a hybrid solution, which is Exchange Online Archiving. So for organizations where they're a little hesitant to switch from on-premises to online, and I will say 80% of organizations have moved to online at this point. So there's only some, the ones who are holding on and kind of keeping on-premises, it's because they may have to for some reason. There are laws at certain points about where data resides and things like that. I guess I can't talk about certain things, but I know that at Nate, when I was at Tech, they moved over to online exchange, and I voiced some concerns about data residency. And they were like, yeah, no, it's good. We checked out, lawyers say fine, And then I found that they had misconfigured it and were storing it in the wrong place anyways, And so, like, it was a legitimate concern, and it actually did lead to a problem. They did fix it eventually, so online was okay, but you got to be careful with these things. It is easy to make a mistake. Okay, so there are always going to be organizations that are just like, you know what, we're not putting our stuff in the cloud, right? And they have a very good reason for that. But if you're not one of those 20%, if you're the other 80, and you're just not quite ready to go over, then what you can do is you can say, well, we're going to keep our main stuff online, like on-premises, and we're going to have our archive data in the cloud, and we're just going to pay for that storage, right? And that just means that your techs don't have to maintain another storage server, it's, you can kind of get a sense of how it's costing you. Archival is cheaper than regular storage. Yeah, nuclear data needs to apparently be stored within Canada. How did I know Jacob would have a story about it? So the folks working on that had on-prem exchange in our server room while everyone else had OA. Yeah, that's a good example. Thank you. And I think the banks would also be very careful, for example, although I don't know that for a fact. So there are lots of bigger organizations, especially government ones, that they'll hesitate, Now, I want to say something about archive too. Like, why is it that people are moving stuff into an archive in the first place? It's because archival is cheaper. The storage that it goes on is less expensive. So when you're going for Exchange Online archiving, they're not putting you on the most robust storage. I mean, it's robust in the sense that there's redundancy, but it's not the fastest storage. Okay, it's meant to be a place where it's kind of like things that you put in your closet, right? It's harder to access. In other words, the storage is a bit slower, but you don't care because you don't use it that much, right? That's the idea of it. So the reason that we archive at all is that we do want to preserve the data, but we don't want to store it on the more expensive primary storage. Okay? So Exchange Online archiving should be a relatively cheap solution, And if you're on premises and you're doing archiving mailboxes, that could be a separate storage as well, which is kind of not quite as beefy or juicy as the stuff that you're running day to day. It might be some older, not quite retired storage that's still very redundant and still good, but you're taking some load off the server by putting all your archive stuff in there. So anyways, you kind of choose your poison in your organization depending on what you want to do. But if you're looking to dip your toe into Office 365,
and your on-premises Exchange Online archiving is a good kind of simple way to do it, just to see and get used to how it's all working, And then you can explore online Exchange in more depth later. Okay. Any questions? And thank you for that example. I'll probably pull that up sometime in the future with the nuclear guys. Okay, so the next topic, this is a shorter one. So this is going to be relatively painless. But this is handy to know, actually. Because there are things go wrong with where data is stored locally on the machines, and it's good to be able to kind of understand the difference between the file formats and their similarities, which are considerable, and then do some kind of troubleshooting. Okay, so I'm going to talk about. That was a little wrong. Oh no, I don't really deal with NSD too much. Okay, so there are three file formats related to Outlook email storage. There's the PST file, the OST file, and the NST file. I'm not really going to deal with the NST files, but they are all closely connected to each other. In fact, I believe they're all the same file format. Essentially, they just have different extensions, really. But the PST format is the oldest of the three. So the rest of the other two just kind of came out of PST. Okay. Microsoft just wanted to make a bit of a differentiation between certain uses of these files. Oops. So I already said that it stands for personal storage table. It is the original way of storing Exchange data on client systems. So it's been around since Outlook 97, okay? And really just intended for local client storage of data, not used on the server side, except, as you know, for import and export targets. Okay, so if we need to take data into a server, we're going to do it using a PST file typically. And if we want to get data out of a server, we're also going to be exporting a PST file. Okay, so that's the only server side use you're going to see in it. The mailboxes that are stored internally don't quite structure things that way. Okay. Now, Outlook these days has stopped using PST files by default. That is to say, your main data storage is not a PST file. However, if you're setting up offline local archive, then you're still going to use a PST file. Okay. So you can create a new one as a user just by going to your account settings in Outlook, and I'll have a little graphic of that in a sec here, and just specifying the location of the new file. Outlook itself will not store inboxes there. So, you're not doing your daily driver work out of this PST file, but you can copy things over if you want to get them out of your general storage, and if you want to archive it. Okay. So here, if you go in Outlook, you go to File, Account Settings, Data Files, and you click on Add. So Data Files here. Click on Add. Here's an example where I've got my main OST data, which has the inbox and all that kind of stuff. Okay. And then I've got a couple of PST files. So old or deleted, that's stuff that, I did delete them, but I just copied them over to a PST as well, just in case. Okay. And then I created this DMIT 2512 one just to show that I could do it, right? Now, what you'll see is that there's, like I said, a lot of boomers and stuff will actually create one for themselves. It'll get rather big and unwieldy. And that's just what they're used to because they've been using it for so long, right? But that's where you can do it manually if you need to. Okay. Limitations. Once you move an email into the PST file, if you're not just copying it, if you're moving it, then it no longer resides on the server, so you don't have any of the redundancy that the server provides. Okay. So the old school users, they can be very attached to their PSTs because that's what they're used to, and they may have had, kind of war stories about bad things that have happened to them. So they may not appreciate or understand the backup failure risks involved in using a local PST. And they may be seeking to bypass any kind of retention policies. So, you kind of have to have a conversation with them. Sometimes you're not going to convince them. They can be a little, and I think, Jacob, you were talking about that too. There can be some people who, they're just a little conservative about change. So they're a little suspicious of online exchange. They're worried something's going to get lost. It's kind of a grandpa thing, except they could be younger than that, but it's a grandpa feel. So now the OST files, that stands for offline storage table. Now you might wonder what's the difference between these two. The difference is not really in the structure of the file. The difference is what you put into it. Okay. So Microsoft has given it a different extension, which indicates a different use, but it's really the same file format. Okay. So Outlook uses OST files to store cached data of what's up on the server. Okay. So the idea here is that it's a bit of a scratch pad that can speed up responses. It's a lot like your cache in a web browser, right? And just like in your web browser, you can get corrupted data in your OST file. And so if you're using it as a cache, that can lead to behavior which makes it look like there's a problem with the server when actually the problem is a bad cache that you have on the local machine. Okay. Now the plus side of this, of having OST files, is they do allow for offline processing. So if you have enough data pulled down, the user doesn't need to be directly connected to the server all the time. It is possible to disable caching mode and not use the OST file at all. Generally, I don't recommend that, except when you're troubleshooting. Okay, so if you do have a corrupted cache and you just say stop using the cache, it'll go directly to the server. And I've seen this before with some staff, where they're like, my mail is like blowing up on me, right? And you turn off the cache, and everything's a little slower, but it all works fine. That indicates that the OST was the problem. What you can do is blow away the OST file and let it get recreated. Okay, and because it's just a cache, it doesn't really matter. So you don't have to do any kind of fancy tweaking or repair of the OST file, which can be a bit of a pain. All you do is blow it away and then let it rebuild. Okay, so it does make for easier troubleshooting. So if you go to File, Account Settings, Email, Change, you can actually go in and you could disable using cache exchange mode. If you disable that, then you're talking directly to the server, and if a problem goes away when you do that, it indicates a problem with cache, right? But you can also use the slider here. So right now the default is download emails that are a year old. Anything older, don't put it in the cache, right? Now, when you're importing your PSTs, as you've probably done already, you might find that none of the data shows up. The reason is they're older, they're like 20 years old, right? So they're not going to show up in the cache, and so you have to click, there's more data on the server, click here. If you click there, they show up, That's because of this configuration. So if you just change the slider so that it shows all your data, it'll pull down all of that, okay? And if you slide it back further, it'll take data away, It's not that you're losing it, it's just it's not showing up in the cache anymore. So exactly the same file format as the PSTs, as just the file extension and the way that it's used that it differs. So your inbox, all that other stuff, those are all going to be in the OST file, but just a subset of what's on the server, right? In terms of offline content, like I said, you can specify what you want to show, at least in terms of how old it is. So this can range from 0 to all. Storing all your data in the OST file doesn't cause the data to be removed from the server. It's just a cache, right? So you're not really going to do any harm with an OST file, at least not any permanent harm. Okay. Now, file corruption, Outlook 2016, that's the one we're using at the moment. That has something called scanpst.exe. Outlook 2019 has that as well. this is a tool Microsoft supplies that can be used to repair corrupted PST files. That happens surprisingly often, okay? And you'll get people in a panic who are like, I can't access my PST, you know? So this can be used to recover corrupted PST files that won't open or they won't be mounted anymore. You often have to run this multiple times in order to fix the corruption, and you're probably going to lose some data. That's just a fact, okay? It's kind of like a file system check. It's very similar, okay? So if it can't recover data, it'll just try and make the PST file workable, you know? So it'll kind of amputate certain components of the data, and then you're left with whatever is left. So, and then there's also third-party repair tools. So ScanPST sometimes fails, but there are people who have come up with tips and tricks and techniques that they've incorporated into a third-party repair tool, and often these work better. Okay, but you got to pay for them most of the time. Okay. And they know, usually if you're coming looking for something like this, they know that you're kind of desperate. So, so be prepared to pay for it in that case. Okay. Here's where ScanPST can be found. It's just a command line tool. Okay. Let's see. So OST files are just cache copies of server data. There's no data that needs to be recovered. If it becomes corrupted, you could run a ScanPST against it, but there's no point. Just delete it, right? So locate your OST file in your data section, and then just load away, restart Outlook, and let it download those files again and recreate the OST. Okay. So I wouldn't really use it on an OST file unless you're doing something like a forensic recovery, right? That could be a good reason. So for example, let's say there's a data residency kind of jurisdictional concern with accessing the server, you may be able to get interesting information out of the OST file. And if it's a little bit corrupted or you've recovered it from deletion and it's not quite mounting, you could use ScanPST in a situation like that. Okay. Like I said, you might have to rerun it multiple times to fix all the issues, and you are facing some lost data. Okay. Now, the NST files, that's less well known, except, you know, I think it's going to become more well known. So they're used to synchronize group mailboxes in Office 365. Okay. So basically, you're separating shared data and personal data that might be stored in OST and BST files. We don't want group mailboxes. We don't want that to mix, right? And so we just put it in an NST file. Okay. This is also used, oddly enough, with Lotus Notes, so it's got some history to it. I don't think you're going to encounter Lotus Notes anymore. It's pretty old school. But Microsoft has repurposed the file, right? So they're like OST files in the sense that they're just storing cache copies of server data, okay? They're not used when giving permissions to a personal mailbox, but only with group mailboxes. So you're not going to see them unless you have that set up. Okay, that's my BOGO 2-for-1. How do you feel? You got a good deal out of that? I'll take your silence as a yes. Okay, I will let you guys. Satisfaction guaranteed. Yeah. We took the same amount of time as a single lesson. Yeah, that's exactly right. I speed talked my way through it. I wasn't quite Mickey Mouse, but I did a good job. I was more like an auctioneer, you know. Okay. Today is the due date for assignment 2. You know that that's flexible, so it's flexible for all of you. But do keep in mind that by next Tuesday, you should have the concepts under your belt and be able to execute most of the stuff that's in there. So it's not like you have to have all of the accounts made or anything like that, but you do have to have the ideas and the commands ready to go. Okay? So other than that, you know, good luck. And then Friday we'll have a good weekend. And Friday we're going to, actually I'll see you next class. So forget about that. But yeah, next Friday we're going to have our first lab.
And it's a bit of a doozy, so be prepared. Okay.
Good yourself.
All right. I'll let you guys go. Yeah, you heard me. Is there a lecture next class, or is there just a work period? It's going to be a quiz. So it's the entire class will be given over to the quiz. That's on Tuesday. Okay. Yeah, no problem. Doors are closed. That's right. We're out of stock now. That's that. Fist bump.